Welcome to WEHI's 2022 International Women's Day address. I'm Doug Hilton and I'm Director of WEHI. And I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which we meet today, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and I embrace their continued connection to this wonderful place. I'd also like to acknowledge the elders from other communities who may be with us today for this wonderful event, and all First Nation peoples who work here at WEHI and in the wider precinct and contribute to making this biomedical precinct so very vibrant. Given the focus on this year's United Nations International Women's Day theme is Changing Climates, Equality Today for a Sustainable Tomorrow, I wanted to further acknowledge the care and connection to country that First Nations people have led and fostered on this continent for over 60,000 years. For Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, country is more than a place. It's really part of an identity. For generations, there have been calls for stronger measures to recognise, protect and maintain all aspects of First Nations cultural heritage, lands, waters and sacred sites from exploitation, desecration and destruction. And I think over the last few years we've seen how very important a task that is. As the trailblazing Aboriginal-led youth organisation Seed Mob recognise, First Nations leadership is critical in the collective fight for climate justice. In this context, land rights is sustainability action. Now I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to Professor Lesley Hughes, who will be delivering the address this morning. We're absolutely thrilled to have you with us today, and I want to thank you for taking a big chunk of time out of your day to share your thoughts with us. I'd also like to welcome and hand over to our host for today's seminar, Shayla Nile. Shayla is Head of Legal and Licensing within the Business Development Office, and Shayla is also co-chair of WEHI's Environmental Management and Sustainability Committee. I look forward to learning more about the women who have been instrumental in leading the way on climate science and advocacy. Shayla.
Thank you, Doug. It's a pleasure to be hosting today's event and to have the opportunity to introduce you all to Professor Hughes. Professor Hughes has a wealth of expertise and insights to offer us, and I'm very excited that she's been able to join us to deliver today's International Women's Day address. Before I formally introduce Professor Hughes, I do want to share some thoughts with you about the connection between sustainability efforts, climate justice and gender equality. Firstly, it's important to acknowledge that globally, climate change affects women, girls and gender non-conforming people in ways that are different and usually worse than men. This is primarily because women, girls and trans and non-binary people constitute the majority of the world's poor and are already typically marginalised by political and economic systems. It is also because they are often more dependent for their livelihood and well-being on natural resources that are threatened by climate change. This is not due to inherent vulnerability, but because of socially constructed gender roles and responsibilities that position women as caregivers responsible for providing food, water and energy for family and communities. In contrast, men often have greater access to education, information, credit and other resources. Women's lack of relative access to these resources that would help them to respond and adapt to climate change is likely to exacerbate gender inequality as the climate crisis worsens. Examining how women, girls, trans and non-binary people are disproportionately impacted by climate change and seeking to rectify this is therefore a critical need, one that requires women as agents of change, leaders and decision makers. Efforts to engage women to act on climate change have typically addressed us as household managers and caregivers, those responsible for reducing household waste and emissions, making household spending decisions and protecting our children's futures. While we know that personal action and responsibility to curb the impacts of climate change matter, we also know that we need sophisticated, courageous and sustained international and national leadership that results in systemic change. Women must be central to this. Whatever our relationship to family, caregiving and households is, whether we have children or not, we as scientists, political advisors, lawyers, economists, social justice advocates, business people and communications specialists. Women should have agency, choice and opportunity to contribute and lead at all levels in the climate change movement. One important caveat: it is not simply about achieving gender parity when it comes to environmental decision making. According to the UN Climate Change Secretariat, although the gender balance of government delegations to climate negotiations has improved, men still spoke for 74% of the time during the plenary meetings held between May and June in 2021. When women, trans and non-binary people share strategy and expertise at the table, we must be given space, listened to, and our ideas progressed. I'm proud of the work that WEHI has been leading, both in relation to environmental management and sustainability and gender equality. Most recently, we joined Australia's Climate and Health Alliance, further demonstrating our commitment to contribute to shared advocacy and action to address the health impacts of climate change. We are very well positioned to continue our leadership in both environmental sustainability and gender equality, and to integrate our efforts in a sophisticated way that sees women as equal players in climate action leadership. In light of these reflections, I'm delighted to now hear from Professor Lesley Hughes on the women who have led the way on climate science. Professor Hughes is the Interim Executive Dean in the Faculty of Science and Engineering at Macquarie University. She is a distinguished Professor of Biology, and her principal research interests have been the impacts of climate change on species and ecosystems and the implications for conservation. She's a former lead author in the IPCC's 4th and 5th Assessment Report, a former Federal Climate Commissioner, a member of the Wentworth Group of Concerned Scientists, and a founding councillor with the Climate Council of Australia. I would now like to invite Professor Hughes to deliver WEHI's 2022 International Women's Day address.
Well, thank you very much, Shayla, and it's an honour to be here with everybody and seeing so many people online that have come to listen. It's really a wonderful opportunity to speak with you all. I'm going to share my slides, and I hope that somebody will tell me if that's not working. All right, what I thought I might do today, given the theme of this year's International Women's Day, is draw to your attention and pay tribute to some of the women that I admire a great deal in this space. Some of these women I have admired from afar for a very long time. Others I count as close personal friends. So it's a bit of a mixture. And I hope you enjoy the journey through me paying tribute to their courage, their passion and their commitment in this space. Now, you may think it's strange, but I'm going to start this journey with a picture of a man, and hopefully you'll understand why in a moment. This is John Tyndall, a brilliant Irish physicist who, until recently, was considered the father of modern climate science. The Tyndall Centre, which is the meteorological centre in the UK, is named after him. John Tyndall was a brilliant experimentalist, and in 1859 he published the findings of the use of this machine that he invented and built. And the machine was designed to test a whole bunch of different gases for their heat trapping properties. Gases like carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, water vapour, etc. And he identified the fact that CO2 had the best heat trapping properties. So he's generally considered, until recently, as I said, to be the person that basically proved that the greenhouse effect actually existed. But we now know he was actually pipped to this post 3 years previously by this woman, Eunice Foote. She was a Renaissance woman of her day. She was a scientist, an amateur scientist, a painter, patent attorney, an inventor. She and her husband participated in many of the early women's rights campaigns. They were signatories to the first Declaration of Rights and Sentiments in 1848 at the very first International Women's Rights Convention. But for our purposes, and the reason that I'm talking about her, is this. She set up an experiment, I think probably on her kitchen bench or in her study, to also look at the heat trapping potential of different gases. It was a somewhat simpler experiment than the one that John Tyndall had set up. But in 1856, she submitted a paper to the 8th annual meeting of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. Now, because she was a woman, she wasn't allowed to go and read her paper. Women were not allowed to be members of that august scientific institution, so her paper was read out by a man. It was called Circumstances Affecting the Heat of Sun's Rays, and this is what she found. The highest effects of the sun's rays I have found to be in carbonic acid gas. These days, of course, we know that is CO2. So 3 years before John Tyndall, Eunice Foote actually worked out that CO2 was the critical greenhouse gas. But she actually went one step further. She foretold the future. She wrote that an atmosphere of that gas would give to our Earth a high temperature. At one period of its history, the air had mixed with it a larger proportion than at present. An increased temperature from its own action, as well as from increased weight, must have necessarily resulted. It's a bit of a convoluted sentence, but what it actually means is that Eunice Foote understood from that little simple experiment that more CO2 going into the atmosphere from whatever source would make the temperature of the Earth warmer. It was only discovered that she had done all this in 2011 when the records of the society were digitised and some sharp-eyed person noticed what she had done. So let us pay tribute to Eunice Foote as the originator of the experimental evidence of the greenhouse effect. Now, no talk about the history of women in the environment movement would be complete without mention, of course, of this woman, Rachel Carson, whose book Silent Spring was published in 1962. Rachel Carson wrote this book about the fact that the chemical industry was actually damaging our environment. Now, these days we sort of take it for granted, I think, that a lot of the things that humans do have environmental impacts. But remarkably, back before 1962, that wasn't really thought about very much. Rachel Carson exposed the machinations of many of these companies. She helped set up the US Environment Protection Authority and is generally thought of as being the mother of the modern environmental movement. Sylvia Earle, a remarkable woman. She is now 87 and I believe she is still diving. She is a marine biologist, an oceanographer, who has worked her entire life to protect the wildlife of the marine systems and the oceans. For example, she was appointed as the first female chief scientist of the US National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, in 1990. In 2009, she founded an organisation called Mission Blue with the aim to protect 30% of the oceans. She was named by Time magazine as the first hero of the planet in 1988. She is still at it at 87. Coming closer to home now, our own Australian Sharan Burrow, an extraordinary woman. Originally a teacher, she became only the second female to lead the ACTU in Australia. And following on from that job, she became the first female head of the International Trade Union Confederation, representing 176 million workers. And she has campaigned tirelessly on the message that the trade union movement must be part of the just transition of workers to a low carbon economy. She is credited with coming up with the phrase, "There are no jobs on a dead planet." Truly a remarkable lady. Most of you won't have heard of this lady, Corinne Leclerc. She is a French-Canadian scientist who studies the carbon cycle. She has a great number of achievements. She chairs the French High Council on Climate and is a Royal Society Research Professor at the University of East Anglia, which is really one of the key institutions in the world studying climate science. She has been absolutely pivotal in our understanding of the carbon cycle and has championed the role of understanding the carbon budget, that is, the relationship between how much carbon is in the atmosphere and the temperature of the planet, as a basis for science-based targets. So, for example, the targets in the Paris Climate Agreement, that I'll also talk about in a moment, are based on the work of Corinne Lequer and her colleagues in understanding that relationship. Her contribution to the science of climate change, and particularly to our understanding of what we must do to mitigate climate change, is absolutely extraordinary. Moving now out of science, but to an equally important woman in this space, Naomi Oreskes. Oreskes is actually a Harvard history professor. She's an author and a science historian. In 2010, she wrote this remarkable book called Merchant of Doubt, where she drew parallels between the behaviour and the tactics of companies like the big tobacco companies, but also the chemical companies that had basically contributed to things like the ozone hole and acid rain, and pointed out that the climate skeptics and a lot of the big fossil fuel companies were using the same tactics to try to slow action on climate change. I think this book was a real game changer. It exposed the sort of the evil on the dark side, and it, I think, forever changed the way we think about and talk about climate change communication. Now moving to a few women who have been extremely instrumental in international negotiations. So firstly, Connie Hedegaard. Connie Hedegaard is a Danish politician. She was one of the pioneers of international climate negotiations. She led the 2009 COP meeting in Copenhagen, for example. She's the former head of the European Commission on Climate Change, and she was the one that implemented the EU climate trading scheme that has served as a model for many other countries. I mentioned the Paris Climate Agreement a couple of minutes ago. It is actually an extraordinarily important international framework for climate action. It was signed and then ratified in December 2015 at the COP Conference of the Parties in Paris. It embeds the goal to keep global temperatures to less than 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels, with the ultimate aspiration of keeping temperatures to less than 1.5 degrees. Its importance as a global framework cannot be understated. But how did it all come about? One of the key phrases that we hear all the time, but is embedded in this Paris Climate Agreement, is this phrase, net zero emissions. We probably hear it almost every day in the news. Surprisingly, this phrase didn't really exist till 2013, and I want to tell you about the role of the women who came up with it. This was the unlikely setting for that game-changing phrase invention. It's called Glen House. It's a baronial mansion in Scotland. In 2013, a group of 30 women got together, but led particularly by these three, to discuss what needed to be done to ensure that the Paris Climate Agreement was going to be effective. The late Tessa Tennant was a key one of the three, and it was actually, the Glen House is actually owned by her father-in-law, Lord Glenconner. Tessa Tennant was a pioneering green climate investor. The second lady, Farhana Yaman, is a British lawyer and activist, has been extremely active, particularly in championing the vulnerability of the small island states to climate change. And then Christiana Figueres, she is a Costa Rican diplomat, and she was one of the three, and I'll mention her again in a moment. It was the three of them together that came up with the phrase net zero emissions and then campaigned to get it into the Paris Climate Agreement, and of course the rest is history. Here's a picture of the climactic celebration when the gavel came down by the President on the Paris Climate Agreement. So I want to highlight these two women on that front bench. Christiana Figueres, again, was the head of the UNFCCC at the time. Less well known is Laurence Tubiana, the other lady. Laurence Tubiana is an economist and an absolute gun negotiator. She led the French side of the negotiations, and I think it's fair to say that without her work, the Paris Climate Agreement may not have ever been created, let alone signed, then ratified. She was absolutely key. She is currently, I'm just looking in my notes, the CEO of the Europe Climate Foundation. Coming back again to home, and you'll see that quite a lot of these women, of course, are Australians. And this is my friend, Natalie Isaacs. Natalie started the organisation 1 Million Women, aiming to inspire and encourage women and girls to be part of climate action, whether from campaigning and advocacy or their own carbon footprint. This organisation today has indeed over 1 million members, which is really quite extraordinary. And I'm very happy to say that Natalie will be presenting the Macquarie University International Women's Day address here in Sydney tomorrow, and I am very proud to be introducing her at that address. She is an absolute inspiration. Now for some younger people. These two ladies are good friends of mine, and they co-founded the Australian Youth Climate Coalition, amongst other things, Anna Rose and Amanda McKenzie. The AYCC now has over 120,000 members in Australia. Anna, a lawyer originally, went on from the AYCC to do a whole bunch of remarkable things and is still doing them. She worked for WWF for a few years running Earth Hour. She helped co-found Farmers for Climate Action, and now she has helped co-found an organisation called Groundswell, which is a philanthropic giving circle that funds climate action projects. She is an absolute force of nature. It's interesting, usually when I get a taxi somewhere, even if the taxi driver mentions, ask me what I'm doing, I very rarely mention that I work on climate change because, usually I just don't want to get into an argument. I have caught several taxis with Anna Rose, and Anna will take the taxi driver down the journey of climate action before she's even been in the taxi for 5 minutes. It's really quite exhausting. Now, Amanda McKenzie, the other half of that power duo, good friend, after co-founding the AYCC, became the Chief Communications Advisor to the Climate Commission, on which I served. And when the Commission was abolished on the second day of the Abbott government, Amanda became the CEO of the publicly funded Climate Council of Australia, of which I am a proud founding councillor and now a director. Amanda is also an absolute powerhouse. The Climate Council would not exist without her. Now, Doug, in his introduction, mentioned SEED and Seed Mob. And so I want to pay tribute to one of the co-founders of Seed Mob, Amelia Telford. She is a young Bundjalung and South Sea Islander woman. She co-founded this Indigenous network. It's the first Indigenous climate action network for young people in Australia. She did that in 2014. She is also an absolute active campaigner against fracking in the Northern Territory, which has attracted global attention. Another remarkable young woman. Anika Molesworth. Anika is a Broken Hill farmer. It is always worth reminding people that not all farmers are men looking for wives. Anika runs a sheep property out the back of Broken Hill. She is also a scientist with a PhD, an author, and another remarkable young woman. She was the other co-founder of Farmers for Climate Action, and she's been absolutely an outstanding advocate for the interests of rural people and the role of rural people and rural lands in the climate change solution. Now, this young woman barely needs any introduction at all. We just know her as Greta. At the age of 15 in 2018, Greta Thunberg decided that not enough was being done by her parliament in Sweden, or for that matter, any other parliament in the world. So with the permission of her parents, she took Fridays off and sat outside Parliament House with a handmade cardboard sign. A few years later, short years later, she was addressing the World Economic Forum in Davos and then the UN, an extraordinary journey. She inspired the youth climate movement and the school kids strikes. And I learnt the other day something is that she still goes and sits outside Parliament House on Fridays in Stockholm. Really quite extraordinary. And then my final young woman is Daisy Jeffrey, also one of ours, inspired by Greta to help lead the school strike movement in Australia. And that picture below there is Hyde Park in Sydney on that first glorious school strike day. I'm in that crowd somewhere, and for most of it, I was crying with emotion. Daisy is an extraordinary young woman. She got involved in this movement when she was 17 in the final year of high school. She's a cellist and she was at the Conservatorium of Music. She led over 300,000 people in this school strike movement. She then wrote a book called On Hope, published in 2020, addressing the need for all of us, not just the youth, to get involved in climate action. So there are my 18 women, and I just want to say a couple of things now about why their work is so important. The IPCC's sixth assessment report is now 2/3 out. The first report came out last August on the physical science basis, and it was dubbed Code Red for Humanity. The second report was released 2 weeks ago, and it's been dubbed an Atlas of Human Suffering. Let me just show you a few pictures about why we're so concerned. This is Lismore last week, where we had people on their roofs, in some cases with their children, for 24 hours waiting to be rescued. There are still people isolated with no food, no water, no power, no means of communication, trying to look after their kids and their pets and their livestock. And this is in the richest state of Australia, a wealthy, developed country. Yet we have been overwhelmed by the unprecedented, unnatural disaster. The Black Summer bushfires burnt 18 million hectares, an area the size of Tasmania. 33 people were killed in the fires, another 400 likely died as a result of smoke inhalation, and half of Australia's whole population was affected in some way by that smoke. 3,000 people lost their homes, 3 billion animals were killed or displaced, and the costs of that is still being counted. The Great Barrier Reef has suffered 3 major bleaching events in the last 6 years due to marine heat waves, with the loss of 50% of the coral. And going back to 2003, this is a picture of the 3-week-long heat wave in Europe. It killed 70,000 people, and a number I still find extraordinary. And we now know that 20 million people or more every single year are being displaced by climate-related disasters, and that number is increasing every year. The Sustainable Development Goals were mentioned by Shayla earlier. They're a wonderful framework for action, and it's these 2 in particular that are absolutely linked: climate action, number 13, and gender equality, number 5. Just want to say a little bit about this relationship. We know, as Shayla indicated earlier, women are disproportionately affected by climate change. They are the primary gatherers of water, food and fibre. They are largely subsistence farmers and caregivers who rely heavily on natural resources, have less access to credit and insurance and emergency services. They are the majority of the 1.5 billion people living on less than $1 a day, and 80% of people displaced by extreme climate events are women and children. Women and children are also 14 times more likely to die from a climate disaster. And climate disasters, we know, increase gender-based violence, sexual exploitation, and human trafficking. But on the plus side, we also know that women also make great environmental leaders, especially during times of crises. A couple of recent studies provide evidence of this. So one pointed to a study of 194 countries that found that pandemic responses were systematically more effective in countries led by women. Another study, which is a meta-analysis of 17 studies, found that when women lead conservation and natural resource management agencies, there is stricter compliance, more transparency, and better conflict resolution. And the Goldman Environmental Prize, which is considered the Nobel Prize of Conservation and the Environment, 60% of the winners have been women. And the final stat, which I find really remarkable, is that there is evidence now that countries in which women have greater equity have 12% lower CO2 emissions. Quite remarkable, I think. So there are my 18 women. I admire them enormously, and while I would never ever put myself up on a pedestal remotely close to any of them, I think I do share one really important motivation with them. For me, it's shown here. My two children are now in their mid-20s, and the thing that motivates me is that I'm concerned for their future, and I want them to inherit a habitable planet in which they can thrive. I think I share that with all of the women that I've just spoken about. Finally, I'd like to leave you with my very favourite poster that was prominent in the 2015 climate marches and since, because it puts the responsibility on all of us. It's basically saying it's not just women, it's not just young people, it's all of us. We are all responsible for the problem, and we all have a duty to try to fix it. And thank you very much. I'll leave it there.
What a wonderful International Women's Day address. Thank you so much, Lesley, for... Am I on, Shayla, or are you on?
You're on, Doug.
Okay, just for a moment I could see the little red square around your face and I thought I was talking to myself. Thank you so much, Lesley. That was brilliant, and I was just so inspired by your introduction of a number of women that I'd never heard of and yet were playing such an important role in protecting the planet, and going back, what, 170 years. What a wonderful journey through time. Shayla, you're going to do questions. Are you going to orchestrate that, or am I?
I'm happy to do that, Doug.
Very good.
Just looking to see whether there are questions coming through.
Maybe I could ask one first. Would that be okay, Shayla?
I think that's a good idea, Doug. I think everybody's busy absorbing all that information and feeling inspired.
So Lesley, a question, I guess, around politics. How do we get away from this sort of hyper-partisan climate, for want of a better word, that we're in at the moment? We see it in the US, probably a few years ahead of where we are in Australia, same in the UK. Yet, you know, if you talk to a lot of farmers, you talk to a lot of people in the country who, you know, us inner city folk might view as being a little more conservative and voting right of centre rather than left of centre. They share all of the same concerns that we do in the inner city. How do we focus on what is uniting us and have our political representatives, you know, elevate the discussion? I think most of us are just tired of all of that.
Yep, well, I'm sure tired of it, Doug, and I think it's a great question. And, it's the $64,000 question. Not every country is divided ideologically on this topic as we are, and I think that the ideological divide is fortunately narrowing, and it narrows a bit further every time we see a Black Summer or a Lismore flood. Unfortunately, it often takes those sorts of catastrophes to bring people together and to make them realise the reality of the situation. I've seen an analysis which shows that the ideological chasm is very closely correlated to the influence of the Murdoch press in countries. So the US and Australia in particular is a case in point. Interestingly, the UK is not ideologically riven by the climate wars. In fact, there is a tripartisan attitude to climate action by all three of the major parties in the UK. And in fact, the UK came to the last COP in Glasgow with the most ambitious 2030 target of any country in the world, which was for a 68% reduction of greenhouse gas emissions compared to 2005 by 2030. So the media have been a big part of this. I think it is changing, and personally, you know, it is unfortunate that I have never given a talk about climate science when most of the questions are not about politics. They're always about politics. Climate change is still a political issue, unfortunately, in Australia, but I do think it's changing. And I would certainly like to see at the next election the balance of power being held by a handful of independents that are standing on a climate platform. I think it's going to be a very, very interesting election, and I'm crossing. And
maybe we need another issue to divide us like the UK. Maybe we need a Brexit rather than a climate change.
Maybe that's the case, but you know, it would be great to, you know, people come together at times of crisis, as we've just seen in the last week, as we always see, and you know, for the first time, or maybe increasingly, people are really understanding that the word unprecedented keeps getting trotted out. What does that mean? It means that climate impacts are accelerating. They are going to continue to accelerate for at least the next couple of decades until we get emissions under control. It takes a long time to turn the liner around. So let's hope that coming into this election, that divide is narrowing. I mean, even the Prime Minister has been talking about climate change and the role in so-called natural disasters. So we've been slow to the party. Australia actually ranks last on virtually every ranking of climate policy done internationally. So we have a great deal of journey to go still.
Lesley, there's a question come through. What do you see as the role for an organisation like WEHI in addressing climate change and taking climate action?
Well, look, I think I'd like to see all organisations both examine their own carbon footprints and take action. And I think, you know, there is tremendous attention in the medical field, the health field globally and in Australia as to the role. You know, medical institutions and hospitals, etc., are supposedly responsible for about 5% of the world's emissions, so that's a lot. It's challenging because of the amount of things that are not recyclable. You know, single-use things is a real problem. But look, examining your own carbon footprint, but then being models for everybody else. I mean, everybody that works at the WEHI has families and friends and interacts with other businesses. So taking things that they learn there out into the community can be really, really powerful.
And following on from that, you just spoke about individual efforts at an organisational level, but at a personal level, what do you think are the most effective things that individuals can do in their daily lives to reduce their impact?
Well, I always say that the main thing, if you're over 18, is your vote that counts. It doesn't cost you anything, and if even half the people in Australia made climate action and good climate policy their number one reason for voting for a candidate in their electorate, we would see a lot of change very quickly. So that's number one. Second one is to think about where your money is. Money makes the world go round. Our big banks are still supporting a lot of fossil fuel development, though they're on the move. You can move your money, you can pressure your superannuation system, you can pressure your insurance companies. There are now lots of opportunities to put your money into financial institutions that are not supporting the fossil fuel industry. Other things you can do, and these sometimes depend on your financial wherewithal, but get an electric vehicle if you can afford it. I bought one last year and I plug it into my solar panels and I tell my friends I'm driving on sunshine, and that's a really wonderful thing to feel. Solar panels, of course, electric vehicles, active transport, bikes, using public transport, etc. Transport is about 20% of Australia's emissions. Thinking about your diet, as well as the health aspects of a plant-based diet. A lot of people have written that because agriculture contributes 20 or more % of the world's emissions. Much of that is from livestock agriculture, particularly cattle and sheep, that reducing your consumption of meat and dairy is a really effective way of being part of reducing global emissions from livestock. And then I think it's really easy when you see pictures like of the Black Summer and Lismore, and hear some of our very inadequate politicians. It's really easy to feel disheartened and helpless. And the way to overcome that is to get active, and action is the antidote to despair. And don't do it on your own. You know, join a group. There are hundreds of climate action groups in Australia now. They get their strength from collaboration and their membership. Find one that suits you, whether it's at work or in your community. Join them up and be part of the movement.
There are a number of people who would like to know a little bit more about your research, Lesley.
Okay. I did my PhD here at Macquarie actually. I'm a behavioural ecologist by background, and I spent 4 years following ants carrying seeds around the bush during the late 80s, early 90s for my PhD, and I got to the end of that period and was frankly a bit sick of it and was looking for something different. And it was actually my PhD supervisor at the time that said, oh, you know, climate change might be a thing in the future. Why don't you, maybe do something on that? So I started to read about it and thought, oh, I might get a job out of this more easily than following more ants around the bush. So I got into climate change, and I've often said that getting into climate change research and action is like the Hotel California, because once you're in it, it becomes so clear how important it is that you can never leave, and I will never leave, I suppose. But over the years, I've done a lot of work looking at the impacts of CO2 on herbivory in insects. I've done a lot of work using species distribution models to try to figure out where species will have to go and find climatically suitable habitat, things like that. I would say that about 15 years ago or so, I started moving much more into the climate action and communication space, and that's just really taken off. So these days, I do very, very little hands-on research, though I still try to do some writing. But these days, any time that I have outside my day job, I put into work with the Climate Council and other groups, because I think they are making a difference.
Thank you. We've had in the news in the last few days, in addition to the terrible floods in New South Wales and Queensland, the news that Japanese encephalitis has now been found south of Cape York for the first time, and that's obviously a mosquito-borne disease.
Yep.
On that general topic, are you able to talk to the impacts of climate change on global health and what you see as being the biggest impacts in the coming decades?
Yeah. The Lancet in 2009 published their first special edition on climate change and health and said that climate change is the largest, I can't remember the exact words, but the biggest risk for human health ever. Certainly the changing distribution of vector-borne diseases is part of that. So of course mosquitoes, like any other species, live where they do because of the particular climate there, and as conditions become more suitable for mosquitoes, hotter and wetter, for example, in parts of Australia. Well, everywhere's getting hotter, some parts are getting wetter. Those mosquitoes can expand their range, and therefore the range of the disease also expands. And we're seeing things like malaria up in the Torres Strait outbreaking regularly. We're seeing increases in things like Ross River virus and dengue as well, even before this Japanese encephalitis issue. So that's part of it, but I'd have to say that the general consensus would be that the biggest health impact of climate change is extreme heat and heat waves. In Australia, heat waves kill more people than any other climate-related event. More than bushfires, more than floods, more than cyclones, more than anything. Heat waves have been dubbed a silent killer. They don't leave the scars on the landscape that are really obvious like these other disasters, but they kill a lot more people. So as an example of that, in Black Saturday in 2009 in Victoria, which I'm sure you all remember, over 200 people were killed directly in those bushfires. What is less well known is in the week previous to that, where there was extreme heat waves right across southeastern Australia, probably double that number of people died because of extreme heat. But it's much less obvious. So the impacts of extreme heat and heat waves, as the illustration I showed you from the 2003 heat wave in Europe, are absolutely the most critical health issue.
Just moving back to something, I guess, a little bit more political. Megan says, thank you for your inspiring presentation. What is the most compelling video or short digestible resource that you've come across for helping to explain the science to people who still believe that extreme weather events are just part of a normal weather cycle? And I'm sure we all know people who are still saying that.
Yeah, there's fewer and fewer of them. Let me deal with the video thing first. Look, I don't have in my head right now the perfect video because there's so many of them around. But what I would say is go to the Climate Council website, to the resources section, and there are videos on just about everything. There are also conversation guides around all sorts of topics for you to talk to people. So there's conservation guides around heat waves, around flooding, around bushfires, how to talk to your family, how do you talk to your friends. So please use the resources of the Climate Council. There's reports and myth-busting guides and all sorts of things. So I couldn't identify the best video. I have some that are my favourite videos just because they're funny and short and upbeat, but go and find some for yourself on that website. I would like to say something though about having conversations with out-and-out skeptics. People often ask me after these sorts of talks, what do you say to the skeptics? And I'm afraid my general response to that is nothing at all. The really rusted on skeptics, I can't deal with. If they're, with all of the evidence out there, with all of the science, with all of the observations that are staring them in their face, if they're still not convinced about what is going on, then I'm not honestly going to waste my time with them. I'm going to work with the people that are concerned about positive action. So if you've got some old uncle or whatever in your family that's not convinced, do yourself a favour, just ignore it. Frankly, it's not worth your time. It's much better to work with people who are concerned, who do get the science. You don't have to have a deep understanding of science. You just need to trust that the experts know what they're talking about and work for a positive future. That would be my advice.
I've certainly got a couple of those old uncles, I must say, to my horror. How do we reconcile economies that are based on growth with the climate action that it tends to be based on a contraction and reduction in consumption? It's often posed as an almost irreconcilable problem.
And that's one of, and the perception that we all have to go back and live in a cave and eat lentils to solve the climate action, to solve the climate problem is part of the communication problem that we have. Look, I think we can decouple growth and prosperity from wrecking the planet. And the obvious way to do that is to stop getting our energy from fossil fuels and get it from the wind and the sun and other renewable resources instead. There's a lot of modelling to show that Australia in particular could become an absolute renewables powerhouse. We are one of the sunniest and windiest countries in the world, and electricity produced by new renewables is now substantially cheaper than electricity produced by new fossil fuel infrastructure. So our key is to transition as quickly as possible, to shut down all those coal-fired power stations, to stop digging it up and shipping it out, and instead use the technology that we already have but is also still improving to do things differently. So we can be a manufacturing powerhouse and manufacture all those goods that have become essential to our comfortable lifestyles. We've just got to do it differently. It's not a matter of just stopping everything. It's a matter of being smart and using the technology that we already have.
Slightly more controversial question for you now. This is a very popular one in the chat. How can we move the dial in Australia when the leaders of our two main political parties are men?
Well, there's an election coming up, you know, and we all have one vote. And as I said before, it's our single most powerful weapon for change. So, you know, I'm not telling you who to vote for in all of your electorates, but if you look seriously at the platforms of the people standing, there are a lot of progressive independents standing not only on climate action platforms, but on equity, transparency, you know, they want an anti-corruption commission and all of those really important issues. I bet that there's one of those people in virtually every electorate. So find out, make yourself informed about the platforms and vote accordingly. And in fact, if there's somebody who you really support, go and work for their campaign, do the letterbox dropping, hand out leaflets, be part of that process, be part of the democracy that we want to have.
A related question. Have you got an example of a country where a female leader has been elected and significant movement on climate change has resulted from that?
Look, I'd have to think about it, but certainly Angela Merkel in Germany, who is a scientist, by the way, has done a great deal. It's also the case that the Greens Party in Germany have been very influential, but you know, Germany, for all its faults, and it's an industrial powerhouse, but it has announced the end of coal-fired power in the 1930s and are moving towards that goal. And Angela Merkel was absolutely driving that. So that's one example, but I'm sure there's lots of others.
And thinking about future leaders, we've got a question here. As the father of a very environmentally aware 8-year-old girl who loves to go around the block cleaning up litter, I'd be interested to hear your advice on what are the best ways to encourage and allow young girls to feel like they are contributing to efforts to address this issue.
Yeah, look, it's a great question. Look, the Australian Youth Climate Coalition, they have an upper age limit, which is 30. You get kicked out when you turn 30, including the two founders that I just talked about. They got kicked out when they were 30. I don't know whether there's a lower limit. So your child may well find a group of like-minded people in that. We're also seeing lots of really fantastic initiatives in schools. There's some fantastic schools that are supporting their students in environmental clubs and environmental house captains and all of that sort of thing. So find out what the school is doing and support that. And then also get involved in the group that organise the School Kids Action and the strikes. They have Facebook pages, young people very au fait with social media. Some of the kids, because they are kids that are involved in leading that movement, I got involved with because I did a few sort of climate science 101 talks with them and have been supporting them ever since they got started. And to be honest, some of them are the most impressive people, some of the most impressive people, let alone children, that I have ever met. Really, really extraordinary people. I only had time to mention a couple of them, but there are groups around, and I would suggest getting your daughter into a group and working with others.
Thank you. I think that is all we have time for this morning. We're just about through to the end of the hour. So thank you again so much, Professor Hughes. I think International Women's Day is such an important opportunity to celebrate the role of women in all facets of society, and it's been really great to learn more about the role that women have played in tackling climate change. That those roles often have limited visibility. I certainly had no idea that women had played such an early role in climate science. And I'm feeling very inspired to ensure that we continue to elevate women's voices in all areas, but especially in the work at WEHI of the Environmental Management and Sustainability Committee. Doug, I'll hand back to you to close.
Thank you so much for a wonderful presentation, Lesley. It has been inspiring. Thank you also for your willingness to give us some advice and answer questions. I think I'm certainly feeling more optimistic at the end of the hour than I did at the start, and maybe that's
good.
The battle.
Usually, Doug, I have the opposite effect. So,
and look, I think you set some challenges for us as individuals, as voters, and as institutions. And certainly, I hope we can all step up and make a difference in the world. So thank you so much. And yeah, really appreciate the time you spent with us.
Thank you very much, Doug. It was a pleasure. And onward and upward is all I can say. Thank you.